Hello, everyone, and welcome to the H Plus Academy Roundtable. The Roundtable is sponsored by Humanity Plus. As a nonprofit educational organization, our aim is to stay informed, continue learning, question our own ideas, and apply critical thinking and strategic insight about our history, today, and what might come tomorrow. Today, the Roundtable is focused on the central issues of civilization, namely transhumanism, what it is and what it is not. There's a lot of information out there that we tend to find confusing, and others do as well. So the core focus of this particular roundtable is to discuss those two issues, what it is and what it is not, based on some of the writings of all of our guests. And now I'd like to introduce our guests. Max More, strategic philosopher and author of The Philosophy of Transhumanism. David Wood, futurist and founder of the well-known London Futurists. Myself, Natasha Vita-Moore, professor and co-founder of the transhumanist movement. Emil Torres, philosopher and author of articles that focus on existential threats to humanity. And philosopher and professor as well, Alex Thomas, whose doctorate thesis covers the ethics of transhumanism. I'd like to start with asking our two guests who are on, let's not say the alternative side, but on the other side of the table in questioning transhumanism and have for quite some time. I'd like to start with Emil Torres and ask him his views on transhumanism today, what he thinks it is and what he thinks it is not. And then we will go to Alex and ask him his views, and then we'll respond with ours. So please go ahead, Emil.
Thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet everybody. Okay, so here is my statement for the discussion. Transhumanism comes in many varieties. There is no fact of the matter about what true transhumanism is, just as there is no fact of the matter about what constitutes true Christianity. My primary contention here will be that the most influential versions of transhumanism, beginning with extropianism, but including subsequent variants like singularitarianism, cosmism, and even long-termism, are philosophically flawed and profoundly dangerous. A minimal definition of transhumanism could be the project to use advanced technologies to radically re-engineer the human organism. The movement that coalesced around this project over the past 30 years forms the backbone of what I call the TESCREAL bundle of ideologies, where the acronym TESCREAL stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. The roots of this bundle lie in the 20th century eugenics movement. And at the bundle's core is a techno-utopian vision of the future in which technology will solve all our problems, enabling us to live forever, overcome suffering, conquer the natural world, maximize economic productivity, and ultimately spread beyond Earth to build a sprawling multi-galactic civilization among the stars full of astronomical amounts of value. The philosophical problems with this worldview are many. Leading transhumanists embrace a deeply impoverished vision of human enhancement, whereby the underlying values that determine what constitutes an enhancement derive from a uniquely Western white male capitalistic perspective. The dangers concern the ways in which transhumanism will undermine liberal democracy, exacerbate socioeconomic inequality, restrict rather than promote freedom and liberty, contribute to the ongoing destruction of the environment, further marginalize or even eliminate already marginalized communities, and potentially justify extreme, possibly violent actions. I do not think that there is anything inherently wrong with humans modifying their bodies. However, I do worry greatly about the consequences of flawed humans trying to redesign themselves in a world marked by profound inequalities based on a deeply problematic and impoverished vision of what ought to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emil. Now let's go to Alex.
Thanks. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that. And thanks again for the invite, and lovely to see you all. So really appreciate that. So here's my initial statement. So for me, transhumanism is a very important philosophy because it brings into sharp focus the extraordinary technological possibilities on the near horizon. It offers varied perspectives about what the spiraling co-evolution of humans and technology could look like. At the same time, transhumanism has been accused, even by its own advocates, of being a thin philosophy. Its definitions often try to be inclusive, encouraging as many people as possible to identify with the ideology. Beyond its central contention that we should apply science and technology to re-engineer the human, it is not very prescriptive about what exactly our technogenetic trajectory should look like. As a result, transhumanism has failed to seriously contend with the momentous ethical challenges signaled by our potential transhuman becoming. It answers the ethical question of whether we should proceed at full tilt with a resounding yes before asking what route we should be taking. After all, science and technology may provide a story about what life is, but they cannot tell us what life is for. Another reason why understanding transhumanism is so important is that it has become incredibly influential with some of the most powerful people on the planet Earth today, in particular the technology elites of Silicon Valley. It animates their imaginations and explains their aims and projects. And this points to another immediate failing with transhumanism. In the era of the Anthropocene, the age where the devastating human impact on planet Earth is so great it will be visible for at least millions of years to come, it celebrates the version of humanity at the epicenter of our epochal crises. The grand narrative implicit in capitalism, that endless growth is realizable, is supported by the grand narrative of transhumanism, that endless progress is realizable. We need a different conception for our future if we are to have any future at all.
Thank you, Alex. But let's start with David.
Well, I'm gobsmacked. I've heard such a lot of nonsense from Emil. Alexander was a bit more moderate, but a lot of what he said was nonsense as well. So my goodness, it's going to take a long time to unpick all the misconceptions and misunderstandings there. Singularitarianism, fundamentally flawed. I'm a singularitarian. I believe it's possible, it's not certain, it's possible that within a few decades, humans may no longer be in control of the evolution of this planet, that we will be displaced, if we're not careful, by alien intelligences created by our own big tech companies. That is something that should be considered. That is what singularitarianism is about, to ensure that if such a thing would happen, that we influence it so that it is beneficial for all, rather than potentially hugely destructive, leading the universe into our local corner of it in a bad state. So I think the possibility that humanity might be displaced by AIs does deserve attention. It's a complicated subject, and to say that that's a whole fundamentally flawed conception, it just boggles my mind. To say that the most important conceptions in transhumanism are summarized by this phrase, TESCREAL, I think that's an extraordinarily shallow analysis. TESCREAL includes, for example, long-termism. I don't identify with long-termism much. Most transhumanists aren't particularly focused on, well, if we change what we do now, we might have trillions more people in the vast future. Most transhumanists I know are concerned about the here and now. We are concerned that people are suffering in multiple ways here and now, by disease, by aging, by indeed social terrible things, by climate change that's out of control. We transhumanists, we want to make the world better today in a sustainable way, not just taking everything that capitalism throws us for granted. Capitalism is a mixed thing. It is not just all wrong or all right. It is something like most of the other inventions of humanity, something that needs careful attention. And that's what transhumanists are trying to do. And when Alex says that transhumanists haven't thought about these issues, well, there is a lot of transhumanist literature from Max, from Natasha, from lots of other people. I offer my own hundreds of pages on this. So there's a lot more to say, but I can see we're going to have a lot of probably disagreement.
Well, goodness, yeah, like David, I'm not sure where to begin here. There's so much wrong, I think, with people's misunderstandings of transhumanism. I'm currently writing a series. It's probably going to be at least 8 parts called True Transhumanism. And I somewhat dispute the idea there is no such thing as true transhumanism. Obviously, a lot of these ideas are arguable around the edges and so on. But I think it's important to, as I think Alex put it, keep at least the thin philosophy intact. You can certainly build all kinds of philosophies around that and emphases. But let's not confuse one thing with another. For instance, since this is going to come up a lot, I want to emphasize that transhumanism is not long-termism. Long-termism is something that's really caught on a lot right now. It involves a very specific moral view, that of utilitarianism, and beyond that, of a specific application of utilitarianism. Not just every utilitarian would agree with long-termism. It requires some very specific views about valuing future people who don't exist yet versus currently existing people and so on. I am not a long-termist. I'm not a utilitarian. I actually have never been a utilitarian and find it a bizarre moral view. I know there's a lot of people here who are going to be sympathetic to it, but I just find it totally baffling. But we'll talk more about that later. I won't go into that right now. Yeah, I think this idea that transhumanists haven't really thought about this, it always baffles me, because we've been thinking about this longer than pretty much anybody and in great depth in terms of what human nature is, what the societal effects are, what the economic effects are, how to bring people along. We think about that a lot, and we have. It's demonstrably the case for decades. So when people say, well, transhumanists haven't really considered this or they're naive, it's really people trying to position themselves as smarter when actually we've done a lot of thinking about this stuff. There's a lot of different things to touch on here, but apart from not being a long-termist, I also want to be differentiated a little bit from David, because I don't consider myself a singularitarian, although I don't think we really differ in any great deal. My view is just that I'm somewhat skeptical about the idea of a singularity, of a single point, or a very rapid period where everything suddenly changes all at once. I have reasons for doubting about that, but I think long-term, our picture that David and I have is probably pretty similar. But I do have some concerns about the singularitarian view in the way it kind of shapes thinking into seeing that there's one point, one critical breakthrough. So I want to emphasize that you can be a transhumanist and not accept a singularity. You can think that we're going to have periods of accelerating growth and then steady growth, even maybe declines for a while. As long as you think there is a possibility of an overall improvement trajectory, I think that's transhumanist. Let's see, there's so many things to pick on here. I'm not sure. There'll be a lot of discussion, I'm sure, of the role of the economy, of what capitalism means. I'm not very keen on the term capitalism myself. I'm not sure it was actually coined by Karl Marx, but it was certainly popularized by him. And it emphasizes, depending on what you think of it, it tends to emphasize financial capital, although there's a reason why it can't include human capital. I think that's misleading. What I'm in favor of is markets and free choice and largely decentralized economies. So, will those leave people behind or not, we can discuss. But I think there's nothing against the poor in transhumanism. We want everybody to flourish. It's really a matter of empirically what kind of social systems do you think will do that most effectively? And I tend to think it's ones that are not heavily centrally controlled. I know David and I won't completely agree on this, and we'll probably agree more than some of the other panelists here. But I think we're all in favor of everybody doing better. I think trying to prevent some people from improving themselves and improving the world until everybody can be fully benefited by these technologies is mistaken. We wouldn't have had a lot of the technologies we've had if you have to have everybody immediately having full access. It just doesn't work that way. But certainly we want everybody to have access because people are net beneficial in my view. So those are some of the things that I would talk about. I think it goes into issues of critical rationalism versus omniscient reason. There's this idea that transhumanists want to control everything, and there may be some transhumanists who do. I think that's certainly the case, but that's not part of transhumanism. It should be about critical rationalism, rethinking things, challenging limits, not about trying to enforce a single vision.
The core ideas, in my view, since the 1980s, has been a more humane humanity. And that however we achieve that more humane humanity ought to be at the very core of transhumanism. And I think we're seeing it now. But let me ask, is technology a tool of liberation or control? To put chips in our brains and control humanity, do you really think that that is a future? And do you think that that's a transhumanist future?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you look at the transhumanist literature, the vision of the future that they are advocating, transhumanists, is one of freedom and liberty and so on. I worry that a much more likely future is one in which liberty and freedom are severely restricted, and that restriction is enabled by the development of these advanced technologies.
I agree. Technology can be a wonderful tool of liberation, and it might, alas, be a terrible tool of control and manipulation, which is why we need to understand what the different potentials of different technologies are. It's why we must try, if possible, to accelerate the technologies that are more likely to have positive uses instead of those which have more negative uses. That's not often easy because most technologies are two-edged swords, so to speak, but there is the notion, which, for example, Vitalik Buterin has championed in his own recent essay when he defined his term DAC for defensive acceleration, his own positive vision of a technological future. He said we can only get there if we prioritize the defensive technologies. Now, it's not going to be easy because, as I said, most technologies are both ways, which is why, therefore, we need to have some control.
Yeah, I agree with much of what's been said there. I think ultimately technology is neither finally about liberation or control. Technologies are not just tools that can be used for good or bad, but they are forces that contribute to the kind of constitution of who and what we are. They alter the context in which we find ourselves and change our spectrum of possibilities. But they're also embedded in other relations, such as social, economic, and cultural relations. And that speaks to the importance of thinking about relationality and interconnection, which in my view, most transhumanist literature doesn't do enough. I'm pretty sure the transhumanists on the panel wouldn't agree with this, but I think, again, when you read a lot of transhumanist literature, some of which I'm sure Emil will touch on today, I think that transhumanism is sometimes about the fantasy of liberation through control. I think that the transhuman kind of desire for certainty and control projects the world as a knowledge object that is.
Where's this certainty coming from? You said the transhumanist desire for certainty. Where's that coming from? You just made it up.
No, I haven't made it.
We don't envision certainty. We envision openness. We envision figuring out what's happening.
David,
I'm not going to let this mischaracterized versions of transhumanism be left unchallenged.
In my view, technogenetic developments are best understood as a problem to be, not as a problem to be solved, but really as a condition, and one that's immersed in complexity beyond any hope of rational control or engineering, and therefore humility is required. I worry that transhumanists fall into the trap sometimes of thinking that perpetually increasing our capacities to act, that is kind of ever more instrumental progress, will necessarily lead to a better world. On the one hand, we can indeed interrogate the world using science and technology, and we can make genuine progress in that, and that might increase our powers. But it doesn't necessarily increase our wisdom to direct those powers. And that's not the rejection of science, but the recognition of its limitations as a determiner of what life is for.
Yeah, well, I can understand David jumping in there, because I'm going to hit my head against the wall too. What is this desire for certainty? Certainly when I've written about this, I've talked about pancritical rationalism, which is based very much on the rejection of certainty. But I've written a lot about the problems of people wanting certainty. We see that embodied in religions and ideologies of all kinds. People wanted to reduce the world's complexity to something very simple they think they can control. I've always been very much against that. I think that we should be questioning everything, including fundamentals. That's what, we're worried about pancritical rationalism. So to me, that's kind of the opposite. The transhumanists are the ones who have a least need for certainty. We're the ones who can question the fundamentals of human existence. Everybody wants the certainty of death. They want to either believe they're going to an afterlife, or death gives life to meaning. That's nice and certain. We can be sure we don't have to worry about this bullshit about living longer, because, oh no, we have to have certainty. That's something that transhumanists are unique in rejecting. So the certainty of all the limits of the human body, we're questioning all of those. We're questioning everything. I don't know how this could be a desire for certainty rather than the opposite. But to go back to the fundamental question here, is technology a tool of liberation or control? Well, yes, of course. It is both, depending on how you use it. Technologies, I don't think, have any intrinsic tendency. It depends very much on the cultural context in which they're used. A very communitarian culture will use it differently than a highly individualistic culture, one that's centrally controlled, different from one that's more of a market-based one. But I don't think technologies necessarily have any intrinsic direction. It very much does depend on how we use them, how we desire to use them. And one thing I do strongly agree with that Alex said is that it's hard or impossible to foresee outcomes. We don't know. Yes, humility is required because we don't know how things will work out. Just think back to when Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web as a tool for physicists to exchange some protocols. And look what became of that 10 or 20 years later. There's no way you can foresee the details of any of these things. So that's very much the case. But I think on the other hand, we can't just say, well, let's just stop technological progress. And none of you have said that, to be clear, but some people are, right, to some degree. We can't just stop technology because it has enormous positives that come with it. Without that, we wouldn't have a modern civilization. We wouldn't be alive today. And I think we'll come back to this point, I hope, is that control can itself make things worse. There's always a tendency to say, well, if we just let the things go on as they are, there'll be huge problems. And so therefore we should intervene in this particular way. And there's often not much questioning of how those interventions could make things worse. And I think most of the time they actually do make things worse. So when we talk about the AI pause or other ways of controlling AI, I think in many cases, and some people say that's an exceptional case and doesn't apply to other technologies, but I think in most cases, interfering with these, and by interfering, I mean interfering with individual choices and people's developments, that can bring bad side effects itself. But yeah, I think, I just to follow up on what David said too, because I've become in the interesting position of going from the most sort of radical transhumanist to one that actually arguing for some caution now. I think AI, for instance, is overhyped. And I agree with what David said. I mean, I've been looking at people working on brain-computer interfaces for literally decades. Back right in front of my desk here on the wall, Extra magazine from the 1990s. We have Ted Berger and people like that working on artificial neurons. That was back in the 1990s. And how far have we got? Well, not very far. So this idea that, you know, next year Bill Gates is going to plant chips in our brain through a vaccine or something is complete nonsense. It is something to watch for in the long term. Personally, you know, if I was going to upload or seriously augment my brain with external resources, I want to know who's controlling the operating system. Now, can I back up my own data? Do I depend on Google for permission to access my memories? Can they insert, you know, disclaimers into my memories? No, I don't want that kind of thing. So obviously there are very practical questions about who controls these technologies. They're neither good nor bad. And really just as a concluding point, I want to emphasize that transhumanism is not just transhumanism, going beyond the human. It's transhumanism, and embodies those humanistic ideas of personal liberation, freedom, choice, and all those good things. And I think that should help to inform our view of what technologies we want or do not want.
Thank you, Max. I'm going to comment briefly. I agree with some points that Alex made. I think there are individuals who write and speak about the future, and it's interpreted as transhumanist. And these voices come across as certain, making predictions: by this date, this is going to happen; by that date, that's going to happen. And using the language, this will happen, is going to happen. And I think that it can be problematic. I agree. I think that the level of humility in making predictions is necessary, but in the fields where you make a prediction, and largely that's futurology or futurism, those predictions are part of the toolkit of futurists. And maybe Ray Kurzweil will say this is going to happen by this date and that day with seemingly absolute certainty. No prediction is ever certain. And I try not to make predictions. I'll make forecasts, for example, but predictions always turn around and tend to bite you in the rear end. So they can be dangerous. I think that transhumanists are probably the most adaptable to change. In fact, part of the sensibility of the transhumanist practice is to be able to change, to continually question and transform and adjust to the world around us as things change. But this is going to take us to the next question. And I think this is a really important one. It's been said that there are certain pillars of transhumanism, and they're nowhere in the philosophy, in the manifesto, in the transhumanist fact, or in the declaration where they're ever written pillars. So things change. People can come up with new ideas and add to the flora of information. And that's absolutely fine. Alex, let me go to you on this. In your podcast that you have, in several of your series, the continuation of topics, you talk about the three pillars of transhumanism.
If there were three concepts that really try and capture transhumanism now, which you point to in an essay of yours, Natasha, I would say they're probably morphological freedom, the pro-actuary principle, and existential risk. Now, Emil, I'm sure, will take apart existential risk and show why it's so desperately problematic, the way it's used in transhumanist philosophy, hopefully later. But I just want to spend a few minutes, if I can, talking about morphological freedom. And I want to outline why this notion reveals how inadequate transhumanism is at providing the tools of thought and theoretical framings that actually are needed to deal with the implications of the radical changes that it proposes. So morphological freedom contends that each individual should be in control of their own enhancement, and that no top-down imposition should define or narrow the possibility space of transhuman becoming. Such a notion is kind of, it's contingent really on a conceptualization of the Enlightenment liberal human, employing a kind of individualized rationality free from influence to enable forms of self-determination. But the problem is we've never really been free-floating rational agents. Our reason has always been contingent upon our culture, our experience, and our context. So without recognition of the many ways in which individual autonomy is compromised by aspects of technological development, such as algorithmic biopolitics, data colonialism, and surveillance capitalism, these free markets that Max so loves, rights discourse such as morphological freedom is just unlikely to constitute any protection. Morphological freedom is frankly an 18th century solution to a 21st century condition, and it makes transhumanism look like a backwards looking philosophy, not a futurist philosophy.
So some examples of morphological freedom: allowing women to use contraceptive pills, allowing people to define their own gender, that their gender is not given to them as they're a child, allowing people to take drugs to enhance some of their abilities, allowing people to study different things and acquire new knowledge. That's some examples of morphological freedom. Now, I don't think any transhumanists will say that these things exist in a vacuum. We recognize that humans are part of a community, and that community is influencing us and constraining us, and likewise, we have responsibilities and obligations there. But the vision is that we can, as far as possible, allow people to be free of things which maybe their previous culture, their previous expectation, their previous philosophy has told them they could not change. So they were told, you've got to accept your disease. You know, if you have a disease, that's what you've got to do. They were told, you've got to accept going to war, and dulci et decorum est pro patria mori. If you die, it'll be sweet and honorable for your country. And we are now saying, let's continue the trend towards, where possible, allowing people more choice. And some of this is about new drugs and new medical therapies and new tools. Some of it is indeed looking at these issues which you described, Alex, and which I try to address with the fourth S that I like to talk about, though I realize that not all transhumanists do, which is a transformation of our current democracy, which is the worst form of government apart from all the others, in Churchill's words, into something that is truly better, in which we transcend some of our evolutionary instincts to deceive each other, to abuse power whenever we've got it. As people say, the more power comes more corruption. So that is our nature, and we should look for ways to stop that and transform society. And we've transformed society to an extent throughout history. Two of the greatest inventions were, and to my mind, and not everybody will agree with me, but two of the greatest inventions were the mixed market and separation of powers, that we did not put all the power in one person's hand. In fact, we're very nervous about any one person who has too much power. So separating power is vital. We need more of that, and we need to strengthen it with technology, and that will allow us to have a freedom that is truly worth having.
Thank you. And Max.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Yeah, I'm a very 18th century kind of guy. Everybody knows that. It's kind of an interesting point, though, because to some extent that's true. And that's, again, it's transhumanism. And humanism is an 18th century Enlightenment idea, basically. I mean, it started a little earlier. But there's some good reasons to keep an idea of freedom pretty basic and straightforward. And I like very much what David said. He gave some very concrete examples there of how morphological freedom is very good, and we can multiply that manyfold. So we get down to the concretes, that's what we can see it actually means in practice. I think if we start getting too fancy and saying, well, you know, the concept of individual doesn't really make sense because of data and because of external control and because of subliminal messaging and because of behavioral economics and all this stuff, well, you can get a little bit too clever for your own good, really. You can get into Marxist ideas of, you know, what people's true interests are. So you have the vanguard of the proletariat telling everybody else what their real interests are. And if you don't agree with us, sorry, we're going to have to kill you because you don't know better. So we have to be very careful about these ideas that we can just question the idea of the individual as being a real thing, that freedom is not really real, because if that's the case, well, you go down a pretty dark path. So I'm actually quite happy to keep a fairly basic 18th century idea, along with the understanding of all these, you know, behavioral economics and all the ways that we know in psychology, about which I've written a lot myself, all the ways that our minds don't work very well. Of course, one of the goals of transhumanism, whether it's brain implants or actual modifications of the brain, is one day to actually make us more proof against these problems. But one big issue we have right now is we're talking about these very powerful new technologies, where we still have these stupid pieces of 3 pounds of meat in our head we call a brain. We're still using this very archaic device, not 18th century, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years old, that's dealing with these modern technologies. That's a bit of a problem. So we have to do the best we can with our culture, with our institutions. But in the long run, we are going to have these problems until we can actually make some real changes in the brain, changes that each of us have to decide for ourselves individually. Coming back to the idea of the pillars, I mean, as a philosopher who's tried to sort of define what transhumanism means, I try to think about those fundamentals. And to me, rational is one of those fundamentals. Rational thinking, again, by which I don't mean some omnipotent reason. I don't mean that there's no other means of knowledge or understanding things, but reasoning, especially critical reasoning, always questioning your assumptions, is kind of a fundamental. I think the idea of self-transformation, the idea of, which includes the idea of morphological freedom, the idea that you get to choose what you do with your body and your brain. You don't have to jump on every new technological bandwagon. I don't have to use my phone to check social media every few minutes just because that's the current trend. You get to choose these things. I think that's a very important pillar. What I would call open society is another important pillar. And I think, although David and I don't agree on everything in politics and economics, we fundamentally agree on what he was just saying: diffusion of power, not centralizing power too much. My mixed economy looks a little different than his, but the idea is to get away from centralizing power under one individual. So, and sort of anticipate a little bit Emil's question, but not too much because it's the next question. I actually don't so much favor free markets as I do a sort of meta system in which people can choose their own society. So, for instance, we live in a community with lots of Orthodox Jews. They have very restrictive rules about how they live and what they do on Saturdays, especially, which I don't see any good reason for. But I don't, I'm quite happy to let them live the way they live. That's their choice. They're not imposing it on me. So I actually like Robert Nozick's idea of a framework for utopia, as he calls it, although I don't like the utopia part. But it's a framework within which you can choose the most restrictive community you want, so long as that's not imposed on other people. That's a little hard to do on planet Earth because we're limited in space, but eventually if we get off the planet, maybe we can actually do that and have some pretty radical social experiments. So I personally think that a very large dose of free markets, which is not at all what we have in the United States right now, would be good for most people. But I think people should eventually get to choose as much as possible their own rules. Alex, you mentioned the proactionary principle, which I think is sort of implicit in some of the other principles. But yeah, I try to define that as contrary to the precautionary principle, because obviously if we shut down all new technologies until they can prove that they're safe, we're never going to have a transhumanist future, but we're not going to have much of a future at all. So I think you could argue that's kind of a central idea. To me, that's kind of built into the perpetual progress principle, which I think is also a central one. But one of that hasn't been mentioned exactly is what I've defined as dynamic optimism or practical optimism, to distinguish it from the sort of the, oh, I hope the future is good. It's basically, again, it's part of the Enlightenment tradition that we believe that by goodwill and using scientific thinking, critical thinking, we can make the future better than the present. And it's a commitment to doing so. And I think that's a pretty core part of transhumanism, because not unique to transhumanism, but I think that's an essential element of it as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Max. Emil, the next question here says, let's focus on the topic of economics. What is the future of capitalism? How can we take a look at it anew? And how is it relevant to transhumanism? And if not, what do you suggest as an alternative?
Yeah, good question. I just want to note explicitly that just about every sentence that has been uttered by Max and David, I find problematic. And I wish we had the time or space. With respect to capitalism, I don't really have that much to say. I think capitalism has been a huge force for harm in the world. It's the underlying reason that we're in environmental catastrophe right now. Climate change is going to be catastrophic. There are an estimated 1 billion people who will die because of climate change by the end of the century. 2 billion will be displaced. In the US, yes, it's not like completely free markets, but much more than like in Europe. And there's a reason that the United States is at the bottom of the list in virtually every category of life quality or anything related to life quality compared to the rest of the global north. I lived in Europe for a long time. It's very socialistic. Some would say the quality of life is just orders of magnitude better. So capitalism, it's responsible for the environmental crisis. It has not, in many ways, it has profoundly harmed people in the global north, especially people in the global south. So this sort of like, I mean, also capitalism just informs to such a great extent the transhumanist vision. It's all about maximizing, about extending, increasing, information processing, all of these properties that are useful metrics within the domain of capitalism and the domain of machines are inappropriately taken and exported into the domain of humanity. And so our vision of what a better enhanced human ends up being defined almost entirely by the economic system and the domain of machines and so on. And I find that's part of the reason I find the transhumanist vision to be deeply impoverished, because you talk about wanting to be more humane. That's a big the sort of lack of humanity in the transhumanist vision is one of the reasons that I actually embracing this notion of epistemic humility was a transhumanist, and then decided that transhumanism actually is not the right path forward. So there's a lot more to say about that, and I'm sorry for rambling.
Oh boy, we need at least 5 hours just on this one topic, obviously. Yeah, Emil totally agrees with me. I just totally disagree with him as well. There's a very slowly rising temperature. We've got 3 millimeters a year in ocean level rise. There's no crisis. In fact, if you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with the IPCC. So go look at the material. What you're actually hearing is people's misinterpretations of a summary of the IPCC's work. There's no climate crisis. And to blame it on capitalism seems to be quite absurd. You're not going to blame China? Really? They're giving far more emissions than the US. It's growing rapidly in China and other countries like that. Environmental problems actually are not created by capitalism. They're created by people who want to consume stuff where we don't control the externalities very well. A proper part of a market system is where you do control those externalities, where you make sure that you absorb the costs of what you do. And what you find is in markets, like, very good at conserving things, because if you own a resource, you want to shepherd that resource, you want to maintain it over time. Whereas if it's collectively owned, I mean, this is obviously known as the treasury of the commons, it's very well known. If something's collectively owned, you have no incentive whatsoever, other than some vague goodwill, which doesn't seem to work out very well in reality, to conserve those resources. So you use them up as quickly as possible. So collective ownership is a disaster here, as we see in the oceans, by the way, which is, where we do get overfishing because it's hard to control property boundaries, although we could do a better job. Well, I mean, there's just so many examples we could go into, but I strongly disagree about that. You're saying we should blame the world's conditions for capitalism. Yeah, let's blame capitalism for people becoming vastly wealthier than they were a century ago, for the huge numbers of people, billions pulled out of poverty, which is an increasing process. Let's blame capitalism for that. I'm fine with that. I really find this baffling. Again, capitalism is not my term because that covers a whole wide range of different economic systems, including extremely interventionist ones, where you normally have private ownership, but you have very centralized control through regulations. That could be called capitalism. That's not my kind of capitalism. I have a lot of problems with the existing one. And to say that Europe has quality of life orders of magnitude better than the United States, come on, Emil, that's extremely hyperbolic. You may or may not think it's better, but there are a lot of things US doesn't do well comparatively. If we talk about the healthcare system, please don't call this a market or a capitalist healthcare system. It's absolutely not. We have a vast amount of government spending and intervention, Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, the whole drug approval process, the whole way. I mean, this massively regulated environment, just like education is, and not surprisingly, it's one of the things we don't do very well. But we also have people who drive a lot more miles. We had this discussion a few days ago. People who drive many more miles, so we have more accidents, we have more suicides, more homicides for various reasons. There's a lot of different ways of comparing healthcare systems. I think actually ours is immensely expensive unnecessarily, but it's actually pretty good. But to blame capitalism for an imaginary environmental crisis is strange to me, when actually it seems to be the best hope of solving the real problems do exist. And there are real problems like deforestation. When you don't let farmers make a living another way, they're going to cut down the forests, especially if they don't own them. So those are real problems that we address, but they're not due to markets or capitalism, unless by capitalism you mean something quite different than I do. But yeah, this is obviously a massive area of disagreement that we're not going to get too far on in a couple of minutes here.
So I mean, I think first of all, when transhumanists, I mean, Max is doing a better job than I ever could to show up what transhumanism really is here. Of climate change, I think they reveal their ideological commitment to markets and the Western notion of progress, and for them that absolutely trumps a commitment to science. It shows it's an anti-scientific movement in my view. Also, additionally, you know, we could talk about how competition would lead to the way in which competitive markets could be the driving force for what looks like the human future. So it wouldn't be a kind of liberation, again, morphological freedom, but rather the kind of commercial imperative driving what we are. I would like to ask transhumanists to reflect on why such toxic ideas emerge out of this discourse of its free market fundamentalism mixed with this idea of progress as the ultimate good. So I think that, you know, that gives us some sense of when you mix the very real possibilities of extreme transhuman futures with market ideology, this is where you end up, in those kind of imaginaries, and I think they're profoundly dangerous. And I don't think capitalism is at all a future that we want to exist in, with radical technologies there to kind of exacerbate the inequalities that we currently have.
Well, let's talk about capitalism, or actually I'd rather talk about free markets, because that's the starting point. And I agree with Max that free markets can do tremendous things, but as Max will admit as well, there are failure modes of markets, well-known failure modes, and there should be a wide, intelligent discussion of how do we get the best out of the possibilities of free markets without falling foul of the failure modes, such as the tendencies of markets to move into cartels or monopolies that no longer have the innovative livelihood, and the monopolies have too much power. There is the lack of attention to externalities, in which things are chosen because they boost economic value without taking account of the wider costs that aren't in these equations, and the whole topic that Max also raised of the possibility of the commons being spoiled because of people pursuing their individual profit motives. So there are a number of possible fixes to that. I don't agree at all in throwing out free markets just because there are some failures of free markets. It's more a matter of fixing it. Likewise, I don't agree with throwing out all regulation because there are some horrific failures in regulatory system. It's a matter of us studying them and reviewing them and making it better. So my vision for the future, for the foreseeable future, until it all gets changed by potentially a singularity, is an improvement on the mixed market model and the separation of power. Briefly on climate change. I think there is some evidence that things are getting better. The forecasts for what the temperature rise is likely to be. It used to be feared that the choices that humanity was making would push the temperature up in a few decades to 3 degrees. Now it's thought that the temperature rise won't be quite so fast. So on one point, it seems that humanity is doing a reasonable job in quickly switching over to cleaner technologies. On the other hand, and this is what worries me personally, some science is saying that we might be closer than we thought previously to tipping points that push the change in the climate out of the linear incremental mode, which I agree is something that we ought to be able to tame by technology, into a more of an exponential acceleration in which we change the direction of the currents in the Atlantic, or we have more accelerated feedback. And that is a real worry. And people who look carefully at what's been happening at the COPs say, yes, we are making progress, but it turns out we need to make even more progress more quickly than we had previously thought. So there should be more investment in green technologies and in negative emissions technologies. But I think we need politics to improve as well. I really believe we need a carbon tax, and I really believe we need wider attention, not just to the transport, but to lots of other industries such as agriculture and manufacturing of steel and plastics and glass and fertilizers. So it's a big topic, and we should have a grown-up discussion about it. But the answer is not, hey, let's stop capitalism. The answer is, hey, let's improve capitalism. And we have improved capitalism in the past, and it's slid back sometimes. We need to be constantly vigilant, as John F. Kennedy said.
Thank you, David. Max, do you want to make another comment, and or Emil?
Yeah, I'll check out this really brief, because I'll get too annoyed if I go on very long. It really pisses me off when people start saying it's anti-science because I don't buy into the world's not going to end tomorrow. Look, the IPCC doesn't agree with you either, Alex. It's too bad. Go look at their table of likely effects by 2050. You'll find there's almost no known effects other than some more high temperature days. There's almost no temperature signal by the mid-century, and even by the end of the century. I'm talking about the IPCC, which to me is distorted in favor of more extreme scenarios. It doesn't agree with these apocalyptic views at all. So, oceans going up at 2.5, 3 millimeters a year, big freaking deal. So people have been living underwater for a long time. We can handle those kind of things. We can adapt. There's no crisis. There are some local challenges that we have to adapt to. For many places, it'll actually be a benefit. And this is never actually really considered. People look at the cost. They don't look at the benefits. There's no doubt that rising CO2 actually causes better plant growth, warming up places that are too cold. Depending on which studies you believe, between 3 and 13 times more people die of cold than of heat. And so by preventing a little bit of warm up, you could be actually causing a large number of deaths. Any change away from the status quo, of course, imposes some costs, but you have to look at the benefits as well as the costs. There's nothing anti-science about this. The IPCC itself does not agree with this kind of apocalyptic worldview. On the whole, with David, David and I sort of agree and disagree. I think he's right that you have to look at externalities, and this is a complex topic we can't get into too much. But my whole point was that externalities is not a favor of markets. It's a failure to design markets properly. So if you, for a long time in many parts of the world, we had common ownership of forests and lakes and various resources. And you can look at the Soviet Union as an example too, where everything was supposedly owned in common, but actually controlled by the central authority. But in effect, nobody really owned anything. It's like in the collective farms, what happened was people overused resources massively. When you own resources, you have a reason to take care of them, because otherwise you're depleting your own wealth. So I think in general, you want markets to work for the environment. They're actually quite good for the environment. But you have to tweak the rules. That's why I don't like terms like capitalism, because what does that mean? Capitalism can mean a system of completely unrestrained people pursuing their profits, but that's not what I'm in favor of. If you're talking about not having property rights, letting people pollute my environment, that's not free markets to me. You're violating my market, my ownership rights. So you have to design these things carefully, and that does require a lot of intelligent thought. For instance, I would agree that there's somewhat of a problem of monopoly in drug markets and other areas. That's not capitalism's fault. That's the fault of stupid politicians and economists who won't redesign patents, for instance. Why should we have the same number of years patents for all these different industries with different payback periods? I think that should be more market-based. You should be able to challenge patents a lot more easily. And everything is blamed on capitalism when it may be the fault of politicians, of bad rules and regulations, people not thinking about the way we've done things in the past. So yeah, I think markets work very well, but you have to design the markets. You have to enforce property rights properly and let the markets work. Now, there may be some cases where that doesn't do the job sufficiently. And David may think there are more cases than I do. My view is that one problem we're seeing, and we're seeing with some of the panelists today, is they're comparing an actual real system that works pretty well with an imaginary non-existent system that's perfect. And I want to hear what the perfect system is. I'd like to hear what Alex has to say about his perfect system that's so much better than capitalism, because we've tried a number of other systems in history and they've worked pretty badly. In fact, they've had some disastrous results. So it's a little bit one-sided to say, oh, it's capitalism's fault, whatever capitalism means, and then not to have some alternative that's concrete in mind, because you can't compare actual system with an imaginary ideal system that isn't going to work out the way you think it is. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And I'll be a lot more on my blog about climate issues and what the actual science says versus what journalists are claiming it says.
I just want to be clear to everyone listening. What Max has said about climate change is not true. Okay. I know climatologists, I read the literature. Climate change is going to have catastrophic consequences, and a main underlying cause is extractive capitalism. It's this capitalist system that has driven people to plunder the planet. I'm glad he's not a deforestation denialist, but the climate change literature is absolutely crystal clear that the consequences will be catastrophic. It's not just climatic changes. It's our impact on the environment driven by the capitalist system that we have has been absolutely devastating. Since 1970, the abundance of wild vertebrates, so mammals, reptiles, amphibians, sharks, and so on, has declined by 70% since 1970. The exact number is 69%. There's a paper out in 2012 that had 30 authors from around the world, and it warned that we may be on the verge of a catastrophic, sudden, irreversible shift in the global ecosystem. And they warned in this article that the results could be catastrophic to the underlying pillars of modern civilization. We're in the early stages of the sixth mass extinction event. This is a permanent record in the geological, a permanent mark in the geological record. I encourage people to actually read the scientific literature. What Max is saying is 100% false. This is science. Honestly, I'm not going to debate climate change, because go talk to a climatologist.
I think there is the difference between forcing and non-forcing emissions, that the CO2 and the other greenhouse gases that humans emit is a small fraction of the actual other CO2 gases and other things. But the point is that the human contribution accelerates all the other stuff, which is why we must address it. If you look at the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere, from the 1970s onwards, it's the Keeling curve. It is unprecedented. And so it's true that a lot of it is the Earth's feedback to what humans are doing, but it is humans who are the linchpin in that and are making that transformation happen. So I want to suggest we don't debate climate change more now, but I think it is an important discussion. I will be saving the chat for my own personal interest. I will look at the references that various people have put in there. But I want to suggest that not all transhumanists have the same view on climate change.
I think the things to bear in mind is, if you're blaming capitalism, are you sure it's capitalism rather than something else at the fault? Nobody's addressed my point about Soviet Union or China, other countries that are environmentally much more disastrous, are not considered the exemplars of capitalism. So that's one point. Climate change itself is, of course, a dishonest term, because the climate's always changing regardless of human activity. I don't disagree that humans have accelerated the warming trends. I think there's unnatural parts of it, but we've accelerated the trends. The question is what to do about it, and how much should we do about it? But just because there is a problem doesn't mean you should do everything possible to change it. Like forcing us to go to zero carbon by 2050, in my view, is an extremely horrible idea, which is going to destroy a lot of people's lives. So you have to look about what are the responses better? What are the optimal responses? Should he be forcing people to change energy systems? Should be taxing carbon that Dave is in favor of, which I would also be in favor of if I thought it was actually a negative externality, but I don't. But that's a factual disagreement. So I think it's a matter of looking for the things that are actually causing the trouble and trying to address those, rather than blaming it on a particular system, or saying human beings are just no good, it's better if we all die off. I don't think those are particularly useful approaches.
I put the latest 5 countries that are polluting the most. China's 30%, United States is 15%, India is 7%.
Polluting with what?
Yes, so
polluting.
China is the number one polluter currently, contemporarily. Historically, the US is by far the biggest polluter. And also, I mean, the Soviet Union, yes, first of all, I don't think it was as catastrophic. Its environmental impact wasn't as bad as the US. It was bad. Nobody's looking to the Soviet Union as something to emulate in this context. But also in terms of blaming a system, I mean, part of solving a problem is properly diagnosing the etiology. What are the underlying causes? So if we have I mean, I would recommend Naomi Klein's work. There's some other scholars who have written extensively on this, but sort of understanding that extractive capitalism, this profit-driven need to just go out and plunder the earth for all of its resources. This is an underlying cause of our current catastrophic predicament, in which 1 billion people, according to most recent studies, are expected to die directly because of climate change before the century is over, and 2 billion are expected to be displaced. 2 billion. Imagine, think of the border crisis in the US right now.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Where there's tens of millions at the US border crossing. Billions of people. I mean, the situation is I mean, there's a reason climatologists are in a state of utter despair. It's not just the situation that we're in, but also the fact that there are so many people out there, I guess like Max, who don't think that the situation is as dire as it actually in reality is.
So, Emil, you're saying we have to change capitalism. What exactly do you think will happen? What would you like to see happening? What do you think is feasible and credible?
I think the first step is actual effective regulation. of, and I mean, Max talks about free markets. I mean, the government has, a lot of the big success stories of the free market, they got all their money, from from the government ultimately. I mean, Elon Musk is like a good example. He's all about, capitalism and free markets. I mean, the derogatory term that was used back in the 90s was welfare queen. I mean, that is him. And so all of this is to say that we need immediate, I mean, at this point, it's a bit too late. I mean, we're just trying to keep things under 2 degrees.
Okay,
from,
so
industrial levels,
our
but
group discussion is asking us to please get off climate change.
Yes, please. We've got 4 more topics to go through.
Well, let's talk about intelligence.
I think that there's a little of an overemphasis on intelligence in perhaps within transhumanism, but I think more so in the critics of transhumanism who don't actually read our stuff. I mean, you and I have talked about improving wisdom, not intelligence,
Yeah.
and goodwill. And when I talked about self-transformation back in the 1990s, I emphasized that it's not just about intelligence. Intelligence can be very dangerous, right? Some of the smartest people can be the most dangerous people. They're very good at getting what they want. That's really what intelligence is about, right? It's about understanding and being able to get what you want. That if what you want is not good, then that can be a very problematic thing. So the ends are also very important as to, I mean, the means are very important as well as the ends. So I think we have to think about wisdom. And as I was saying a little while ago, we have certain limits on what we can do here. We can use culture and philosophy to try and improve the way we treat one another. But there are certain limits because we did evolve with these brains that are really designed for an environment that hasn't been around for like 100,000 years. Well, 80,000 years whenever we started real civilization. So they're not very well adapted to making good decisions. There's a limit to what we can do about that. Certainly we shouldn't give up. I think the rationalist movement, I have some real issues with the way it works today, what people call the rationalist movement today, but I think rationality is very important in trying to become more rational. But we really have to work on our emotional intelligence. And again, that's going to be very hard to do without actually making some changes to the brain. But just increasing intelligence alone, that's not going to be enough. That can be, again, it's like technology. It can be used for good or bad. Intelligence isn't inherently good. We might have an optimistic view that the more intelligent we are, the better we'll understand ourselves. But that's kind of a different form of intelligence. Self-awareness and self-understanding doesn't necessarily go along with the ability to think complex thoughts. So I think we have to have a richer idea of what we mean by intelligence, or else recognize that intelligence isn't the only thing that matters here.
I agree. We need not just analytical intelligence, we need creative intelligence, ability to conceive of things differently from what's been conceived before. And then we need critical intelligence. We especially need critical intelligence these days when there's so much fake news and clever, distortive narratives around. So that's more important than ever before. And we can't do it by ourselves because it's just too complicated. And so an intelligence is arguably even more important is collaborative intelligence, which is knowing who we can trust on various subjects, knowing the right kinds of partnerships and communities to join so that we can get to the bottom. So who are really the reliable people on climate change, for example? And as Max said, we have to go for emotional intelligence too, because this is a profoundly disturbing time we're living in. There are huge possible benefits, there are huge risks, and so we need stronger emotional intelligence. But the whole point of it, again, as Max said, is not to be more intelligent, it's to achieve something different, which transhumanists have often called flourishing. It's not just naive happiness or bliss, it's a broader thing. And I liked Alexander's comments in his show recently, it's eudaimonia, this broader notion of flourishing. And it's that's a complex topic too. So just as we spend time decomposing angles of intelligence, we should spend more time decomposing and understanding eudaimonia at an individual, group, collective, planetary levels.
Especially in the discussion that we just had, we don't want to go back to it because our audience are a little bit antsy. But if we could have these different levels of intelligence, not just high IQ, but more compassion, a stronger grasp on our emotions, our fight or flight instincts, what causes us to be angry and annoyed and lash out or exaggerate and fib, and the fake news and some of the issues that Alex talked about with the information becoming so demanding and controlling of us. How do we assess where the actual reality is? And I think that AI is necessary for us to do that. I think that it's just like in the longevity community and biomedical interventions, looking at applying AI to sort through DNA data, to look at proteinomics, to look at all the omics, to better sort out personalized medicine, and to get to the core of the disease and identifying it and hopefully solving a disease. AI is very much needed. How could AI best help us today with how could increased intelligence and combined with AI help us today to sort through some of the most daunting problems that we're facing as a humanity? Let me go to Emil and ask you.
I'm not sure AI is going to help with that so much.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to say about that. Also, just to add to your comment and David and Max's comments before, I agree about intelligence. IQ means almost nothing to me. There are so many different flavors of intelligence, different kinds of different ways of being smart in the world. So I think one of the most striking things about transhumanism, I would say that the test rule movement in general, is it's very monochromatic. It's a very, it's male dominated, it's almost entirely white, and so on. And then these individuals are making claims about what the future of humanity as a whole ought to look like. And I see it methodologically problematic because it's just the only, I mean, in terms of wisdom, the way to move forward, the way to figure out what the pillars of one's normative futurology ought to be, that has to involve other people from different demographics, from the global south, individuals with completely different lived experiences and so on. And that's the only way you're truly going to get a humane and inclusive and beneficial for everyone vision of the future.
I'd like to just comment on that briefly. Our attendees are from all over the world, different backgrounds. Transhumanism has many projects in Africa, in the 54 countries of Africa. The Center for Transhumanist Studies has scholars from, it's a global group, and but there are plenty of women, and we just need to recognize them more. Alex, go ahead, please. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and there's been some great things said about this just now, which I wholly agree with. I do think, though, there is a tension that this question points to in transhumanist discourse, not in true transhumanism as you guys are framing things, but in the wider transhumanist discourse. And that is between the more kind of long-termist school, the Bostromist school, the utilitarian school that Emil, I'm sure will explain a bit further. But that very much does have this kind of, relies on this very much hierarchical notion of IQ. And it's quite a reductive hierarchy. It's really interested in how intelligence can be used to extend itself, colonize, control, etc., and it essentially sees it that which wins in an evolutionary game, I think. Now, I agree that your transhumanism is different. Your extropian transhumanism is different here. It focuses more on freedom of choice and the individual to choose for themselves what intelligence is, what enhancement is. But I do worry that one reason those two versions of transhumanism often live quite happily side by side, not always, but sometimes, is that, well, really, because of the kind of underpinning the faith in markets, and in particular the influence of thinkers like Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek on the extropian school, that essentially you've got a faith that markets will bring up, markets are the kind of higher form of intelligence that will bring about the desired effect. It sees the market as the ultimate form of intelligence, and that in that way, that which thrives in the market will command all of life's resources at the expense of everything else. The extropian view as well, it's reliance on markets to determine ultimately what is the greater good and what is the best, the thing that should flourish. I think that ends up in the same place of a hierarchical version of being, and not an expansive, multidimensional version of intelligence or other forms of enhancement, which you guys have referenced here. I would say as well, I'm really pleased to see you guys at least engaging with kind of coming up with more nuanced and finesse notions of intelligence. And I would also like to see us think more about notions such as wisdom, cognition.
I think that the core of transhumanism, as I said, stems from self-actualization. Let's go to David. What do you have to say, David?
I've already commented on intelligence, but I will say that Extropy didn't just look at market as the mechanism for progress. They also looked at the science, the history of science, and that is not progressed by markets. The scientific community has a different set of processes, and Extropy and transhumanism and me look at the scientific process. Although it's not perfect, it has issues, which we could talk about, is part of the broader understanding. So I will not accept that Extropy just looks at markets as the be all and end all for making all decisions.
What are the ideological drivers and what are the particular normative futurologies that are shaping the current race to build AGI? And our claim is that you cannot provide a complete explanatory picture of the current race to build AGI without reference to transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, and so on. All of these have played some kind of significant role in shape, all of the major AI companies right now, OpenAI, DeepMind, Anthropic, XAI even, those all emerged directly out of this test world movement. So the claim is not that everybody who identifies as a long-termist is also a transhumanist. There's plenty of room within this framework for individuals to identify with one or more of these ideologies and not be a part, not be considered a part of this, test world movement. And so long-termism is a worldview that largely subsumes this sort of Bostromian variant of transhumanism.
Why don't we actually focus on the specific issues of long-termism and its relation? If he has some dangerous ideas, we should be discussing those ideas and whether they are or not necessarily part of transhumanism.
Influencing what people are deciding in the heads of these companies.
Yeah.
Because Emil has talked about 3 dangerous ideas at least. And I think rather than bundling them all together, it'd be far better to unbundle them and look at them separately. So Emil is saying the idea of radically re-engineering the human species, whoa, that's dangerous, we shouldn't do it. I think that is part of what transhumanism talks about. And we say, let's radically re-engineer the human species, but with great care.
Yes.
So that's one thing. The second one is when people say, oh, it's very risky that AI might change the world. That's a separate notion. And I also believe that that is true. And I think it is entirely correct for people at the FLI and FHI to say, let's be cautious with creating this new alien mind, which we don't quite know what it's going to do. But you want to link this again, Emil, with long-termism, which is a specific idea which Will McCaskill and others write about, which is that somehow the needs of people who are not yet born, because they're potentially such large numbers, they outweigh what should be decided today. And so it's worthwhile making people suffer today terribly in order to have some chance of making future lives a little bit better. And that is long-termism, as you've defined it. And I don't see that as bound up at all with the motivations of most of the people we've talked about. So Demis Hassabis, he is the person who is running the organization that is probably most likely to create AGI, albeit I still think they're going to overtake and catch up OpenAI. What does he put on his website from the beginning? He didn't say long-termism, long-termism, long-termism. He said very simple: 1, create intelligence; 2, use intelligence to solve all other major world problems, including climate change, including poverty, including cancer. So that's what's been motivating him. I don't see anything that he has written in terms of his advocacy for long-termism. Shane Legg came and spoke at London Futurist in 2009. This is before they had actually founded DeepMind, and there's nothing in his talk there that emphasizes, hey, we're thinking that the needs of these future people far outweigh people today. I think it's the same with Sundar Pichai, it's the same with Jeff Dean. These are people I know a bit. I've never heard any of them suggesting in a practical term that this is what motivates them. They are instead motivated by the 2 things I've already discussed, that we could build intelligence and allow us to be in a much better world. We'll probably have to transform society as well as transforming the human condition. We might have to change capitalism too. They're all open to these ideas, but they don't have this long-termism thing in. So let's unbundle it rather than imagine everything's tied together.
Yeah, I agree. Unbundle.
So first of all, I'm not saying that all transhumanists are long-termists.
But you did say that the people who are building AGI are motivated by TESCREAL.
I said that they come out of the TESCREAL movement.
But
That
what
doesn't mean that
is
every one
terrestrial
of them
movement? It
is,
is a
that doesn't mean,
fantasy. It does
that
not
doesn't,
exist.
that
There's
doesn't
a
mean that every
bundle
one
of
of
things.
them,
There's a whole bunch of separate things. It's not just one massive ideology in which we all sign up to EA, and we all sign up to long-termism, and all sign up to singularitarianism, and all sign up to extropianism. Most people in the transhumanist movement don't even know what all of these things mean. And the people who are actually building AI, the building AGI, most of them don't care about many of these things either. So it's a false picture, and it's a shallow
right, it's
picture. And I
not.
said at the beginning, it's something that appeals to small minds. It is not a fair representation of this broad, highly differentiated community. Think that bending this long-termism thing in and saying that everybody is the same, who is important and significant, is wrong. And we should look at the individual question separately. Is it wrong to try, is it dangerous to try and radically re-engineer the human species without thinking about it carefully? Is it wrong to try and slow down the growth of AGI because it might be disastrous? Maybe that's a risk in its own right. These are questions I'm quite happy to have a good discussion on, but I don't want to discuss this false history that people like Demis and Sundar Pichai and Jeff Dean, who are actually building AGI, are the ones that are somehow motivated by this particular philosophy.
Right. So again, I think a lot of this just is kind of shooting in the wrong direction. These aren't some of the, when you describe what some claims of mine are, I would disagree with them. That's not what I'm saying. Also, yes, I 100%, the notion of the Tescrow framework, it's not about saying that one can't analyze these ideologies individually. I am all for that. In the paper that Gabru and I have forthcoming, that's precisely what we do. So, but maybe that's for another discussion.
If I could get a word in on the topic, because this is something that is a lot of philosophical interest to me. I wrote my doctoral dissertation back in the first part of the 90s on personal identity, and of course my inspiration was Derek Parfit. So I'm very familiar with this book. The part I paid least attention to was part 4, which is all the long-termist stuff. And the reason I didn't pay much attention to it was because I thought the moral theory on which it's based was completely unappealing and repulsive to me, utilitarianism. So I didn't pay a lot of attention. Maybe it's too bad, maybe because I would have been in a better position early on to address Nick Bostrom, Nick Haskell, and so on. I have some major problems with long-termism, which is why I very strongly want to resist the idea that somehow coterminous with transhumanism, that it's the same thing, that it has to go together, because it really doesn't. First of all, this idea that we should weigh the interests of people who don't exist yet, who live, potentially in the future, seems to me utterly bizarre in itself. That they should count more than actually existing people living today with lives and projects and feelings. That people who don't even exist, who may never exist, should be weighed as heavily. That seems to be very flawed. The idea that we can actually calculate the future seems to be utterly absurd, that we can actually figure out what 1 million years, 1 billion years, 10 billion years from now, when we occupy the entire universe, what actions today will lead to the best outcome. That seems to be utterly ludicrous, and does indeed fall into that kind of technocratic view of rationalism that we get blamed for, which is not at all something I ever support. I think there's massive uncertainty in what we can know even 5 years from now, let alone 100 years on the other side of the universe. So it seems to me incredibly arrogant kind of thinking that you can actually make calculations. And that is a natural outcome of the utilitarian basis to me. Utilitarianism to me is very unappealing for numerous reasons, but one of which is that it does display an enormous confidence in our ability to calculate effects of things, no matter how remote they are, rather than intentions or our immediate environment. It's also a very totalizing philosophy. It's basically telling me, it's ordering me and you and everyone to maximize a certain thing, which is described as pleasure or happiness, whatever the hell that means, which is not itself a clear idea at all. And I agree with David, eudaimonia is a more appealing notion. So you're maximizing something regardless of what you have to do, and that's where you get the repugnant conclusion, and you get some pretty awful thought experiments, because that leads to that. It basically turns you into a robot. Going back to the idea of cyborgs, which we haven't gotten to and may not, but cyborgs are given orders by other people. That's why we don't like the term cyborg. They are cybernetic orders. They're guided missiles. Go destroy those people and correct course until you hit them right on the head. That is what utilitarianism is saying morally. Basically, it's saying, here's your objective, maximize it. I don't give a shit about your loved ones and whether you have to murder your dogs or your children. Yes, kill your dogs because they're using too many resources. I'm sorry, that's a very anti-human morality to me. So this idea of weighing people who don't exist yet, this arrogance about the far future, and this totalizing aspect of utilitarianism, all to me are very, very bothersome. And probably one of the small areas in which I agree with Emil, I think that is very disturbing and something to be resisted.
May I add something just real fast, and then I'll stop talking for a while. I know Alex hasn't had a word in for quite a while. I'm not saying that transhumanism is coterminous with long-termism at all. My claims are that long-term, two main claims. Long-termism emerged out of the transhumanist movement, at least one prominent variant of it. I think that's factually true. And the other is that most long-termists, especially most leading long-termists, are transhumanists, at least in some substantive sense, of the Bostromian variety.
I'd accept that, yeah.
So yeah, those are the claims. So I 100% agree that there are, extropian transhumanists who don't like any long-termism any more than certain EAs do. And no more than somebody like me it does. I used to be a long-termist, by the way. So
Emil does amazing, brilliant historical and sociological work. I'm really pleased, Max, that you're pan-critically reflecting on the specifics of his issues, and you've quite rightly pointed out some errors there. But I think that should be the focus, to critique that long-termist ideology. But I'm happy to move to the last point, because I know we have to leave. I've got something I'd like to say about.
Well, rather than that, and since we only have a few minutes left, why don't I just open it up for you to, each of you, to make your closing statement?
So what I'm often hoping is that we will actually find out what are the factors that are motivating the people who are building potentially cataclysmically disruptive technologies. Are they motivated in reality by long-termism? Is that what's motivating? Are they motivated by the profit motive? I don't think either of these is the case. I think what motivates them is a complex mix of other things. And the regulatory environment is something that we should be tweaking in order to guide them so that they take less risky actions, that they don't engage in a race in which they cut safety corners and do things that we'll all regret. So that's what I would like to see coming out of this. Let's not come in with too much of an ideological presupposition. Let's have the facts inform us. But also, let's see what can be done. Let's have a positive vision. And my positive vision: sustainable superabundance for all. I think it is possible. It is feasible within just a few decades. I think AI, if we regulate it wisely without impinging too much on it, but if we know what are the parts that need to be regulated, we can have a much more wonderful life, broad wonderful, not just a narrow wonderful, for everybody. And we can heal our relationship with the environment. That is within our grasp, and we should not lose sight of that simply when we get bogged down by arguing over which transhumanist had the biggest influence in particular times.
One thing I did want to say briefly, that something as Emil mentioned, and I'm not sure if I interpreted correctly or not, but he seemed to be sort of identifying rationalists with what I call the rationalists today, who are the effective altruist types. And I just want to remind everybody that rationalist has a very long tradition that goes back way beyond those guys, and I don't think we should cede the term to them. Just as Natasha was trying to get me to avoid using the word progress, but I'm actually quite in favor of progress. Just because progressives have taken it and given it a certain meaning is not reason to abandon it. I'm more ambiguous about the term capitalism, as I mentioned, because that could mean a lot of very different things to different people. Yeah, as with David, I think let's keep our eyes on the goal here. Let's think about the huge positive potentials of these technologies, and certainly guard against the downsides. But at the same time, also guard against those who are guarding against things, because they can go overboard, they can shut things down, they can overregulate, they can overcontrol. And in many of these critical discussions about about technology policy or markets, it's very reflexive for people to say, well, there's a problem, so we should give control to the government to do this, without any thought of what governments have done in the past. Yes, there's such a thing as market failure. There's also a certain thing called government failure. Governments and government bureaucracies have their own incentives. Anybody who's enforcing a policy on other people is going to create certain incentives. So let's not just criticize existing systems. If you're going to criticize existing systems and suggest change, you have to be clear about what you want to change it into. Because some of the things you could change it into, in fact, I guarantee that 99% of the things you could change it into will be worse. So be very careful about what you do there if you're compelling people to follow your particular vision. But hopefully we can agree on the fundamental basics that no matter how complex we think the ideas of freedom and individualism and choice are, that overall we would prefer to use technology in a way that enriches our choices, it gives us more opportunities, raises everybody up, not necessarily to exactly the same level, but raises everybody. And my personal big fear is not climate change. I stand by all the stuff I posted in there, including IPCC's words. My biggest fear is actually we're going to destroy our civilization by stifling it. We're seeing so many trends in that direction. Economic growth has slowed way down, productivity has slowed way down. Everything is getting more and more regulated. There's some slight hopeful signs that nuclear power might be coming back into favor, which it should never have gone out of favor. I think, if you're a big climate fear person, then you should be also very in favor of nuclear power. And it's bizarre that many climate people have been against that for so long. So let's be careful about shutting down existing systems without something we know can work to replace them. So hopefully get together, pursue those positives, but let's be a little bit careful about things that we stop doing rather than trying to do some of the good things on the positive side. And I look forward to continuing to read your work, Emil, and to listen to your work, Alexandra, and get to grips with those. I think there's some very productive conversations here. We may wildly disagree on certain things, but that's fine. I can tolerate that. I think getting into some of the specifics, I would love to be on your show if that's still an open invitation, Alex, and debate these things further. That's it from me.
Go ahead, Emil. Yes.
Yeah, this was a super interesting conversation. Really, my main worry with respect to transhumanism is how this notion that we ought to re-engineer humanity is going to play out in the real world. I mentioned in the introductory remarks, there's a playing God's argument against transhumanism that I don't find compelling at all. But I am worried that in this particular milieu, in a world that's dominated by capitalism, competition, where as a result of unregulated free markets, you have enormous disparity between people at the top and the people at the bottom, with individuals like Elon Musk making, I don't know what he makes, I calculate at one point $90 million an hour or something like that. So just in this world, what is going to happen when you develop technologies, assuming they're even possible in the first place? So I'm not even sure that the transhumanist project is possible, but if it is, I mean, there's just this push by Silicon Valley elites to re-engineer humanity. I'm just deeply worried about the real world consequences, and I appreciate that Max and Natasha and David have emphasized the importance of this being egalitarian, it benefiting everybody. I'm worried that that's not going to happen. And also then, Natasha, I know you emphasize that there are transhumanists all around the world, but you also noted that, it's certain people who get cited, it's individuals who are influential. And so another major issue I have with the transhumanist movement, as it has existed over the past 30 years, is the fact that it has been dominated by certain people with a very particular perspective on the world. And consequently, their vision of the future has been shaped by this narrow parochial perspective. And that perspective is very white male. It's a very Western, very Baconian, capitalistic, and so on. And that there's just an extraordinary diversity of alternative perspectives of what the future ought to look like. And I think it's really important to incorporate individuals who embody those alternative perspectives in the process of designing the future to begin with. It has to be that process, not. Thank you so much for having me. And now to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks all. Thanks very much again for the invite, and it's nice to speak to you all. For me, as much as I'm personally enjoying life and would love to live hundreds of years, especially in a playground of radical abundance, I would loathe to see such a world come about at the expense of other people and other life on this planet. It's vital to me that the right of some humans to live for hundreds or thousands of years doesn't come at the expense of the vast majority to have any kind of life at all. And I think that's the real challenge that transhumanism must step up to. Just a note as well on the question of enhancement, I would just point out that depending on how the human is conceived, the question of what constitutes enhancement does change. And so if the human is conceived of as a kind of latent God, as per Steve Fuller, who we've noted is not perhaps the best example of a transhumanist, then increased instrumental capacities are its prerogative. If it is conceived as a consumer, as per perhaps more extropian or libertarian views of transhumanism, then this is also true. People, if you can afford them, you have the right, the implicit assumption that you're responsible for your own capacities, an entrepreneurship of the self, and where you lie in that market ecology will just determine whether you get any life or not. But if the human is an animal embedded in complex relations with other species and nature at large, then enhancement is contingent on the health and sustainability of its relations. If the human is conceived as an environmental threat, then enhancement is surely that which limits our instrumental power or else otherwise directs our exploitative life ways. So let's make sure that the transhuman trajectory is not perpetuating an entitled, instrumentalist, exploitative, colonial, unaccountable, unrepentant technogenetic trajectory. We need to work together to make sure we build a different story.
Thank you. And I'll be the last one to give my closing statement. I'm going to share screen and show you what my work is. Full scope of transhumanists from the 1990s, even the 1980s onward. Elevating the human condition. Our mission, please take a look at that to find that some of your worries and concerns are being addressed. Our leadership, as David Wood duly noted in the chat, a diverse board of people with different backgrounds, ethnicities, etc., and our outreach. So it is not a white male group. Now, this is transhumanism. This, again, around the world. You can see some of the projects that we do in different countries, teaching children in Ethiopia. We've raised over $200,000 in 2023 for education. Here we are again, South Africa, Sweden, South America, etc. Here at our summit, we had 3,000 people in attendance. This was in 2021. Diverse range of ethnicities, again, not all white men. The people who are actually in the trenches doing a tremendous amount of work. Our projects show this again, our different conferences and events. This one's on AI, and recently we've affiliated with a new group that is amazing. It's Women in Longevity Leadership. If we look at the future of molecular manufacturing and nanotechnology, there's many articles written and a lot of work being done on how do we clean up the mess. And so that could be the topic of a future conversation to make sure we're all on board, we have our facts correct, and we can have a good, healthy dialogue about that. For one topic, another one would be
AGI is going to change everything, and so we do need to discuss it, not all the time, but quite often. It's probably worth having a discussion on climate as well, unencumbered from the other issues. So people who don't want to talk about it don't need to come, but people who do want to talk about it can come. I think some politics we've done in the past has been wonderful to an extent. You know, capitalism has been modified by politics. And Max has some suggestions. We should look at alternative ways of managing the commons apart from common ownership. So there was a couple of books he posted earlier by Max Border. Maybe we should revisit that. I know we looked at it in one of these sessions a couple of years ago, but it's such an important topic.
There's also Eleanor, surname I'm forgetting right now, has some interesting work on managing commons too in new ways. Must have dig that one up.
Okay, we have a starting ground for some deeper communication and discussion and good solid arguments where we achieve stuff. And that's what arguing really is supposed to be, right? Where we learn and we rethink and solve the problems that we're faced with. Thank you all so much for being here. It's gone longer, but the conversation was so tasty, I couldn't stop it. Have a wonderful weekend and see you all soon. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.